Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. I'm coming to you from a supercharger in Hawthorne, which is almost in sight of the SpaceX headquarters. I saw it driving over here. I think it's hidden behind the Lowe's over there right now. Anyway, I didn't want to talk to you about Teslas. I wanted to talk to you about Chevy and their Bolt. And the reason why is because my brother owns one. I think I've mentioned this before. And so I've had an opportunity to drive around, and I talked to him about the recall and about what happened with their Bolt. And they actually are rather satisfied with the whole situation because they got a better battery out of it than they originally had. They had a battery that I think, geez, I'm trying to remember what he said. But anyway, I think they got something like 35 extra miles out of the vehicle. So they're pretty darn happy. So basically they got a couple of years of driving on the car, and then they got a new battery pack. So they got an extra 30 something miles out of the car. But this is one of the reasons I believe that, GM is canceling the Chevy Bolt. And what I wanted to talk about was the numbers. They sold, if I'm recalling correctly, 13,959 or something right around there. Chevy Bolts in Q2 of 2023. That is down from 19,000 and some odd in Q1 of 2023. And then of course their Ultium platform, which is the Lyric and the oh gosh, what is the other one right now? Oh, the Hummer. I can't even remember because so few sell. But anyway, those vehicles are just selling like in the double digits. Like the Hummer, I believe, is up to like 48 vehicles sold in Q2 from the whopping 2 that sold in Q1, and the Lyric, the Cadillac Lyric, is not even up to 1,000 still. So they're selling really pathetically. So it seems, most people would be like, wait, the Bolt is the only one that's selling any reasonable number. Why wouldn't they continue selling that for the foreseeable future? But one thing that's really interesting about that, of course, is that they just basically have said that they're not going to make any money, or they haven't made any money. They don't, Mary Barra is not as honest as Jim Farley with Ford, so she hasn't come right out and said that, but it's pretty obvious that the issue is that vehicle is a big money loser. They just can't make money on it, and they believe that they might be able to resurrect the vehicle in the Ultium platform, which is their new platform, but that also sounds like that's kind of a, what would you call it, a dead man walking, dead battery system walking, that it seems like that's not working particularly well for them. And the first two vehicles, like I said, the Hummer and the Lyric, are out with the Ultium platform, and that has not functioned particularly well. And then the next vehicles that are coming out, the Silverado and the Blazer, and one other vehicle as well. But those vehicles, they're pinning a lot of hopes on, but they don't, if these other ones have been any indication, they've had some significant problems getting batteries. They've had significant problems, getting these things up and running, getting the production lines going, and I would almost guarantee you that they're not very profitable yet because they're not making hardly any of them. So you have to mass scale something in order to make money on it. The interesting part about all of this is that the Bolt is actually, dialing this back in time, my brother and sister-in-law back in 2017 or 2018, of course they live in Southern California, they wanted to be able to get the HOV lane stuff and all of that. There was a big deal to being able to get an electric vehicle, and of course at the time Tesla still qualified for the $7,500 tax credit that they requalified for again. But they put themselves in line for a Model 3, but they couldn't wait long enough, so they actually passed off the reservation to my niece, who I just saw yesterday, and her baby is adorable. But anyway, they passed it off to her to take the reservation, and they went ahead and bought a Bolt because they could get one at the time. And that car was actually what convinced me to get a Tesla. So kind of a weird story, but I had a chance to drive it around in like 2018 when the Model 3 was ramping, and it was the first time that there was a Tesla that was anywhere in the cost range that I and my wife could conceivably think of. And so I drove the Bolt around, and I was like, wow, these electric cars are super zippy and they're really, really fun. The Bolt is a much smaller car. I'm in a Model 3 right now, which is a sedan, and we did manage to fit 5 people in the Chevy Bolt last night to drive to the fireworks at El Segundo. But it's tight in there. It's a hatchback. It's pretty reasonable for what it is, but it's a small car. This is a much bigger car. This seats 5 people very comfortably. The Bolt does not seat 5 people very comfortably. It's a tight squeeze in there, but it's a great city car. It zips around really well. And of course, with the supercharging that will become available to GMs in the near future, this stuff right behind me, they'll have access to this via the North American Charging Standard. That means means that Bolts are going to be a reasonable option, because one of the problems, of course, was that it's difficult to charge them anywhere except at home. And my brother did tell me that they did have problems with that, because for a period of time they were commuting and having to charge up in Calabasas. And when they were doing that, they were having issues finding chargers that actually worked and that charged at a reasonable speed, etc., etc. But that they still find the car pretty reasonable. I drove it recently, just a couple of days ago. He let me drive it again because I wanted to test it out, and it drives well. It actually feels a little bit more like it's on rails than a Tesla does, at least the Model Y. The Model 3 feels like it's on rails, of course, but because it's a smaller car and because the suspension is so tight, it feels like it's on rails. So I actually enjoy driving it. So in other words, for the consumer, the Chevy Bolt is a pretty reasonable vehicle. And so as consumers, we're probably like, what in the world would GM even consider canceling this vehicle for? Because it's a good vehicle. It's the only one they're selling in the multiple, actually in the thousands. But you can see that the sales have been depressed. They've been going down over the last several quarters. It's been a really difficult road. Quarter one or quarter two of last year, I can't remember, but they had the recall, the full recall on, and they had stopped manufacturing the vehicles entirely. So they only sold a couple of hundred back then. So it's been incredibly bumpy for GM. And of course, that battery recall is billions of dollars, and they have split it with LG. That's the company that made the batteries. But basically, you know, GM and LG have split the multi-billion-dollar cost of replacing these batteries. And now they've become a little more jerks about some of the batteries and saying like, oh, we'll monitor it, and if we see that it's a problem, we'll give you new batteries. But my brother and sister-in-law had purchased one long enough time ago that it was definitely faulty batteries. So they did have a problem, because of course they had to turn it in for a long period of time to get it repaired, which was a problem. And on top of that, before they did that, they had to park it outside. They couldn't park it in their garage. And the problem with that is that they didn't have a place to charge the vehicle, because they had to charge it in their garage, because that's where they had their charger. So that part was a pain, but the car is still a pretty nice car, and it drives reasonably well. And for the price, I can certainly see people thinking that it would be a good option. But it's an obvious money loser for GM. It's one of those things where if it was up to the consumer, I think that vehicle would actually do okay. It's never going to sell like a Tesla is going to sell, but it can sell in the tens of thousands. And actually, if they really ramped it up and made it cheaper, it could probably sell in the $50,000, $100,000, $150,000 models per quarter, no problem, because it's a pretty reasonable vehicle. But the issue is that GM is, who knows what they're losing, but they're probably losing, especially with the recall, they're probably losing maybe double what they're charging for it. So if they're charging around $30,000, it's probably costing them around $60,000 to make that. So they're probably losing about 100% on the vehicle cost. That's just based on what Ford is doing. That's complete speculation, and I have no internal evidence. But the obvious, the obvious answer to the question is they must be losing money, and it's got to be a lot of money, because otherwise they would just go ahead and suck it up and continue to scale that vehicle until they could make it at least break even. I think the problem is that it was such an early platform, and it was such an experimental vehicle for GM, that they just couldn't figure out how to make it properly. And of course, as opposed to Tesla, that's gone in and taken the Model 3, which was originally a problematic vehicle, difficult to build, the production hell, all of that kind of stuff. And they just kept hammering away on it and hammering away on it, and doing the front and rear castings, reducing the part count, making the quality much higher, making it much easier and faster to produce, so that it has become a very profitable vehicle over time. GM has not done that. They stuck to a much more traditional method of just, here's our model and you get what you get, and we're not going to really upgrade it very much. So the issue with that, of course, is that if you have an unprofitable, difficult to manufacture vehicle from the get-go, it's going to remain that way. It is not going to magically become profitable if you don't put some effort into it and do another generation. So from GM's commercial perspective, it makes sense that they would dismantle the Bolt EV right now. They would work on the other Ultium platform ones, and then probably the Bolt EV, the new one, if it ever comes out in a couple of years, would not be based on the Ultium platform. My guess would be it will be based on some sort of cylindrical cell or prismatic cell, something like that. But they will have more of a they'll work more along the lines of what Tesla is doing and a lot of other companies. So that's probably what's going to happen. You know, it's a little unfortunate for consumers because, again, I drove the car. It's a perfectly reasonable car. It's not exciting. It's nothing like a Tesla. It's not driving a Tesla, but it is a perfectly reasonable car. It does well for what it's supposed to do. Great city car. And for a consumer's point of view, at that cost, at that price, pretty reasonable cost, a pretty reasonable car. So why not buy that car? That is a reasonable option, especially now that GM has their $7,500 tax credit back, although I don't believe that they get it because they probably get $3,750 because I believe that the batteries are being manufactured outside the United States. So anyway, but still, it's a pretty low cost car and it's a pretty reasonable car and it's not exciting, but it is something consumers could get excited about. But clearly they are making such negative profit on the whole thing that they have to get rid of it. All right, so anyway, thoughts from a supercharger. Let me know what you think about that. And actually, if you own or have owned a Bolt EV and a Tesla, I'd be curious to know what you think. So I've had the opportunity, because I've rented this Tesla right here, this Model 3, to drive them kind of back to back. And the Bolt, it feels like a go-kart, weirdly enough. It just feels like it's so small and so on rails that it drives like a go-kart, whereas the Model 3 very much drives like a car, but it's also a heck of a lot of fun to drive. It really does have great suspension, but it also feels like a real car as opposed to kind of a go-kart car. All right, so anyway, definitely let me know in the comments if you have driven the Bolt and or the Tesla and how you compare the two of them. In the meantime, you know, everybody have a great day. Do the like and subscribe and all that stuff, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.